The following program is a WQLN public affairs presentation made possible in part by Security Bank.
Why did you come here today?
Why did I come here? I'm a great admirer of Reagan's.
Here, Governor Reagan, of course.
I came to see Ronald Reagan.
Why are you here today?
Many years ago, I heard Mr. Reagan speak at the General Electric Company, and I decided then that if he ever got in a position where I could do it, I would vote for him. I hope he does that.
Well, he has a sort of a, shall we say, a conservative viewpoint from the standpoint that the individual effort is very important to the welfare of our country and not to rely upon a big government to supply it all for us. And very much, in my way of thinking, that's very much the way we should be thinking.
Yeah. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Harry Gage of Security Bank, and speaking on behalf of the officers and directors of Security Bank, it's a special pleasure to welcome all 720 of you to this, the third meeting of the Erie Land Executives Club. Before proceeding with the planned program, I have three brief announcements to make. First, our honored guest and speaker today has agreed to take questions from the audience following his remarks. To ease the handling of your questions and to facilitate the television coverage of this event, we are asking that your questions be written on the cards provided at each table and passed to the front of the room to the young ladies stationed at either end of the speaker's table. Second, because of the very high level of public interest in our speaker's appearance in Erie today, arrangements, I'm happy to announce, have been made with our public television station, WQLN, to do a television rebroadcast of this program today, this coming Sunday evening at 10 p.m. Needless to say, all of us are grateful to WQLN for their generosity in making their facilities available for this broadcast. Third, I'm happy to announce the next meeting of the Erie Land Executives Club. It will be held in this room on Tuesday, February the 7th, 1978, and considering the subject matter to be covered, the date is both fortunate and timely. It will follow very closely the President's State of the Union message, as well as the reconvening of the 95th Congress. Included on this program will be a panel of news correspondents regularly appearing on Washington Week in Review, the widely acclaimed program of the public television network. The panelists will include two or more of a group composed of Charles Cordry of the Baltimore Sun, Haynes Johnson of the Washington Post, Hedrick Smith, Washington Bureau Chief of the New York Times, and Neil McNeil, Congressional Correspondent for Time magazine. The panel will, of course, be moderated by Paul Duke, former NBC Congressional Correspondent, and now the Senior Washington Correspondent for the Public Broadcasting Network. So mark your calendars, that's February 7th, 1978, for Washington Week in Review at the Erie Land Executives Club. Seated at our head table today are a number of Erie Land's leading citizens. A number of them are Republicans. One of them, at least, is a prominent and highly successful Democrat. It will be a pleasure to introduce them to you now, and I would ask that you please hold your applause until all are introduced. So, starting at your far right, I would first like to introduce a young, dynamic, successful businessman, a squash player extraordinary, G. David Burton, president of the Burton Funeral Homes. Next, we have Barney R. Radoff, president, Independent Iron and Metal Company. Seated next to him is Dr. Daniel Snow, a prominent Erie physician. Next, it's a real pleasure to introduce and recognize one of Erie's outstanding educators, Sister Laurice Anton, President, Villa Maria College. Next, a leading industrialist, Robert Merwin, Chairman, Erie's Magnetics. Next is a gentleman known, I think, to all of us here, our representative in Congress from the 24th District, Congressman Mark Lincoln Marks. We have seated next to the Congressman the senior partner of Erie's largest law firm and a director emeritus of Security Bank, Attorney Henry A. McDonald. And, of course, we're grateful to Bishop Donald Davis, Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Erie, for his invocation today. Seated at your far left, we have Dr. Ray McGarvey, President of Meadowbrook Dairies. Then, representing the United States Navy, retired Admiral Dennis Knoll. Admiral? William B. Connor, President of Robinson Connor, Inc., the largest independent insurance agency in Pennsylvania. And last but not least, our newly re-elected mayor, Louis J. Tullio. Let's have a round of applause. At this time, it is a pleasure to introduce Carl J. Schlemmer, who in turn will introduce our speaker. Carl, as you know, since 1974, has been Vice President and General Manager of the General Electric Company's Transportation Systems Business Division. He is a 1951 graduate of Purdue University and has been with General Electric for over 25 years, the last 10 years of which have been right here in Erie in a number of increasingly important management positions. His company is Erie's largest employer, and we are honored to have him with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Carl J. Schlemmer.
Thank you, Harry. Ladies and gentlemen, the association of our guest speaker with our community and with Erie General Electric does not begin today, but had its origins in the days when he directed and acted in the televised series General Electric Theater, which association lasted for over 8 years and produced many outstanding performances. It was at that time that he visited the Erie plant and made a series of community appearances which were warmly received and still remembered by those who met him at that time. As a matter of fact, Governor, Eddie Burns, who is driving for you today, also drove for you during your first visit to Erie, and here you are in this picture in our shiny 1954 Chrysler at that time. We at General Electric are obviously proud to have had such a close association with so distinguished a man as the Governor. Proud also to claim him as an alumni of the General Electric Company family. However, Governor, I must warn you that some of your political opposition takes a quite different view. In 1976, Senator Humphrey said in the San Jose Mercury News, and I quote, "I knew Reagan back in 1948 when he was the head of the Actors Union. We went to a labor convention together. We were on the same side then. But then Ronnie went with General Electric and something happened. I think he stayed with GE too long and they overcooked him." Apparently, Governor, he was referring to your more conservative posture vis-a-vis his ultra-liberal stance. If so, I'm sure it would be presumptuous on our part to take credit for so greatly influencing your thinking. But if we did, we're happy to have done so. I say this because a little over 10 years ago, Ronald Reagan emerged on the scene as a new kind of leader. He was not a professional politician, but a citizen who had been speaking out about the need to slow and reverse the growth of government, to reduce its complexities, and to return more decision-making to the people. As governor, he proceeded to implement the governmental philosophy which he had been articulating. Despite strong opposition, he kept bureaucracy in check, leaving the state workforce after 2 terms virtually the same size as when he began. He instituted sweeping welfare reforms that are still the model for the nation, made dramatic increases in support for education, and he put a financially unsound state on a sound financial footing, leaving to his successor a surplus of some $500 million after, and this is pretty impressive, returning to the taxpayers $5.7 billion in tax rebates, credits, and reductions. At the time he became governor, he said no governor should serve more than 2 terms. Keeping that commitment, he returned to private life in 1975, and through the vehicles of a nationally syndicated daily radio program, a newspaper column, and extensive travel, he again shared his perspective of government with the people. This time from the vantage point of having managed the most populous state in the Union, he enunciated his views that government at every level were being asked to do far more than they could or should do. And as they tried to do all the things asked of them, they encroached on individual freedom, stifling in the process the economic system which has made America great. Late that same year, 1975, at the urging of thousands of his fellow citizens, he again became a candidate, and as you know, he came within a few votes of winning the Republican nomination for President of the United States. It is a privilege and an honor to present to you a great leader, a statesman, and a distinguished American, the Honorable Ronald Reagan. Now, Governor, that we have you up here, before we hear your remarks, we've asked one of the best Democratic mayors in America, our own Lou Tullio, to make a presentation to you on behalf of the city of Erie. Lou?
Our distinguished and honored guests, Governor Reagan, Reverend clergy, and ladies and gentlemen, I've asked the governor to stand here just for about 2 minutes while I make this presentation, but first I just want to say this, that our presence here today most surely emphasizes the point that democracy is alive and well in this great country of ours, and nowhere is this democracy more evident than here in Erie, Pennsylvania, where just 1 week ago this past Tuesday, the community elected a political newcomer as its first Republican county executive, re-elected its Democratic mayor for the 4th term in office, and elected its first black city councilman and its first black school director. And I would say that this is democracy in action in all our American city. I just want you to know that, Governor Reagan. Also, the presentations I have, I'd just like to make this comment. Last night, I wanted you all to know that this good Democrat waited 2.5 hours for the governor out at the airport last night. And when I introduced him to my wife, I says, Governor, I want you to meet another good Republican, my wife. And he said to me, don't feel bad, Mayor, I was a Democrat one time too, you know. And grace has now changed, as you know. I have, first of all, the key of the city of Erie. I want you to know, Governor, that most of the Democrats have received the small key. I had this special key made for you. So it says, the honorary citizen of the city of Erie, Pennsylvania, Governor Ronald Reagan, a dedicated public servant, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart. December the 17th, 1977, from Mayor Louis J. Tullio. That's the first thing.
Thank you.
I received a letter from Clint Gerlach, who is a director at the Security People's Trust Company also, and I want to pay special tribute to the security officials for bringing these outstanding speakers to Erie, Pennsylvania. So I say congratulations to you, Erie, and all the officials of security. And in this letter, he said that his wife, Billy, has been working for you at the polls for every time that you ran, and she used to supply all the black jelly beans at the polls. You recall that? So I don't know whether you're going to run for president or not, but in case you decide to, we want, from Erie, Pennsylvania, to give you the black jelly beans to start off your campaign at the polls if you decide to run.
Thank you very much.
And in the event that you do win if you run, I want you to know I've already given an All-American pen to President Carter. I want to give one to you so that you continue to keep the money flowing to Erie, Pennsylvania if you win. And one more thing, that these are the buttons that they've made. It says, "You'll love Erie." I have one for you and your lovely wife, Nancy. And the last thing I have to make this presentation, it's an honorary citizen. I won't read it. All I want you to know that we're making him the honorary citizen of the day. And on behalf of all the citizens of our community, it's just a great pleasure to give him a warm welcome to our All-American city. And we're also going to call this day Governor Ronald Reagan Day in the city of Erie, and we hope that you do return to Erie regardless of whether you run or not. And I also want you to know that most of the dignitaries have been coming in. I usually spend $2.98 on the other phrase, but this is a brass one. And you know, this did not come from you, the taxpayers. I spent $10.98 for this out of my personal money. Thank you very much. This letter is for you, too.
Well, Carl, first I thank you for a most heartwarming and generous introduction and for that photograph, except I deny categorically that I was ever that young. And Mr. Mayor, I am grateful to you for all of this, including the jelly beans. It is true, at my particular polling place, and I never knew until I got the note. Mr. Gerlach, I never knew that it was his wife was responsible, but jelly beans had become quite a fixture in our administration in California. We ran the state on them, and it worked pretty good. And every time I'd come in to vote, there would be a jar of jelly beans, and I'd help myself to a handful and munch while I voted. Well, Mr. Chairman, Reverend clergy, Mr. Congressman, the other distinguished gentlemen here at the head table, and you ladies and gentlemen, it is really a pleasure to be back here. I remember and have many warm memories of those years with General Electric. Now, about Senator Humphrey and his remarks of when we were on the same side, I could only apply by referring to the scriptures. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I did But I'm delighted to be addressing what seems to be a sizable gathering of members of an endangered species. I have a friend in California in business. Every morning his route to work takes him past one of our mental hospitals. And every morning he pulls up his car and watches one of the patients who is out on the grounds pitching an imaginary ball game. The fellow stands there, gets his sign from the catcher, goes into the windup, throws an imaginary ball. And I asked him one day, I said, why do you stop every day and watch that poor fella? And he said, because the way things are going, I'm apt to be in there soon catching him, and I want to know how his curve breaks. I'm going to talk, if I can today, about problems that I think face all of us. The excessive government interference in the marketplace, the host of unwarranted regulations on covering every facet of our lives, and the need to communicate, particularly with those among us who say, oh, I don't have any interest in politics. That's like a drowning man saying, I have no interest in water. Communication, and I've told some of you this before, I'm sure, but it bears repeating. I've had a description given to me of communication. It's more than just someone talking and someone listening. It is necessary to impart some information that can be useful, and of course there is the manner in which it is done. And we've all got to do it better than we've been doing it heretofore. The description I got was from a fellow named Danny Villanueva, who used to place kick for the Los Angeles Rams and later the Dallas Cowboys. And then he became a sports announcer in California. Danny told me that one night he was having dinner over at a young ball player's house, a ball player with the Dodgers. You remember the Dodgers. And the young wife was bustling about getting the dinner ready. They were talking sports. The baby started to cry. And over her shoulder, she said to her husband, "Change the baby." And he was a little embarrassed, being a young fella. He looked at Danny and then back at her, and he said, "What do you mean, change the baby? I'm a ball player. That's not my line of work." And she turned around, put her hands on her hips, and she communicated. She said, "Look, Buster, you lay the diaper out like a diamond. You put second base on home plate, put the baby's bottom on the pitcher's mound, hook up first and third, slide home underneath, and if it starts to rain, the game ain't called. You start all over again." In the election campaign last year, there was a great deal of talk about the seeming inability of an economic system that has produced more for more people than anything the world has ever known to solve now its own problems, unemployment, inflation, and so forth. And as those issues were discussed in the campaign on both sides, they were always discussed in the context of what did government intend to do about them. May I suggest that just possibly government has already done too much about them. That government, by going outside its proper province, has caused most, if not all, of the problems that confront us today. Government does have legitimate functions, and it performs them very well. But of late, it has been getting into areas that are not its proper province. There are a few of us old enough to remember when the only experience you ever seemed to have with the federal government was to go down to the post office now and then and buy a stamp. They were 2 cents each for twice-a-day delivery. Now they're 13 cents for once-a-day delivery to the wrong address. My friend Dewey Bartlett, the senator from Oklahoma, says that last 3 cents on the price is for storage. And he has said that we could improve the Postal Service if we started paying the postal employees by mail. But how much are we to blame? Starting with the traumatic experience of the Great Depression, haven't we turned more and more to government for answers that government has neither the right nor the capacity to provide? But government as an institution, all government, tends to grow, tends to take on added size and power, and so government has attempted to provide those answers. And the result is a fourth branch added to the executive, legislative, and judicial. A vast federal bureaucracy of enormous power, and it determines policy to a greater extent than any of us realize, and we can't remove it from office by our votes. To give you an example how government does this, in 1803, the English government created a new position. They put an employee on the cliffs of Dover with a spyglass and orders to ring a bell if he saw Napoleon coming. England didn't eliminate that job until 1945. We bear a greater tax burden than any one of us ever would have dreamed possible to support this permanent structure of government. In 1930, governments, federal, state, and local, took a dime out of every dollar earned, and less than a third of that ran the federal government. Today, those governments are taking 44 cents out of every dollar earned, and more than 2/3 of that goes to the federal government. Government is the biggest single cost item in the average family budget. It is greater than food, shelter, and clothing combined. It is the fastest growing item, and yet it is not one of the factors used in computing the cost of living. Several weeks ago, the government told us that the American people had increased their earnings by 9% in the previous year. And he said that with inflation 6%, that meant that all of us were 3 percentage points better off, had more purchasing power than the year before. They were being deceitful when they told us that. That was before taxes. After taxes, we were 3 percentage points poorer than we had been the year before and before we got the raise. Government profits by inflation. One of our officials at the economic conference in London several months ago, you'll remember that, it was much ado about nothing, He was talking to the press, and he sounded downright regretful. He said to the press, "You must realize that inflation has no single cause. It's a very complicated thing, and therefore there is no single simple answer." Well, if he believed that, he had no business being at an economic conference. Inflation has one cause and one answer. It is caused by government spending more than government takes in, and it will go away when government stops doing that. Now, I could give an explanation. You know, they've made it sound so mysterious. The average person thinks inflation is something like a plague or the drought or an attack by locusts. It just comes from somewhere now and then. We don't know what caused it, and we don't know how to make it go away. Well, from 1933 until today, in this country, we have doubled the goods and services available for purchase. In that same period, we have increased the money supply to 23 times as much. $11.50 are chasing now what $1 chased before, and that is inflation. There are 73 million working and earning in the private sector to support themselves and their dependents. That 73 million also supports 81 million Americans who are totally dependent on tax dollars for their year-round living. Now, it's true 15 million of those are government employees who also pay taxes. But you must remember, their taxes are simply a return to government of dollars that first had to be taken from the 73 million. I say that to emphasize that 73 million people in this country, thereabouts, are the total source for all the money that government chooses to spend. Political demagogues, aided by spokesmen for a variety of causes, some worthy in themselves, but questionable as to whether they're a proper concern of government, have created a political and economic mythology widely believed by too many people. This, more than anything else, has increased government's ability to interfere as it does in the marketplace. Profit has become a dirty word blamed for most of our social ills. In the interest of something called consumerism, free enterprise is becoming far less than free. And property rights are reduced and even eliminated in the name of environmental protection. It is time for a voice to be raised in behalf of the 73 million, pointing out that profit, property rights, and freedom are inseparable, and you can't have the third unless you continue to be entitled to the first two. And yet, even among ourselves, every time there's a problem, don't we find ourselves saying there ought to be a law? Sometimes I think there ought to be a law against saying there ought to be a law. The German statesman Bismarck said, if you like sausages and laws, you should never watch either one of them being made. It's difficult to understand the ever-increasing number of intellectuals in the groves of academia, sister present company accepted, who contend that the system could be improved if this country would adopt more of the principles of socialism. Now, it isn't that these eminent scholars are ignorant, it's just that they know a number of things that aren't true. In any comparison between the free market system and socialism, nowhere is the miracle of capitalism more evident than in the production and distribution of food itself. We eat better for a lower percentage of our earnings than any other people on earth. 17% of income after taxes is the average cost for food in America. The American farmer produces 2.5 times as much as he did 60 years ago, with 1/3 the man-hours of labor on 1/2 of the cultivated land. 3/4 of the people in the world are engaged in farming. Most of them, the rest of the world, simply scratch a little plot of ground trying to get enough food raised there to feed their families. If the rest of the world could be brought up to the level of skill of the American farmer, despite what the doomscriers say, we could feed the world population on 1/10 of the land that is now being cultivated worldwide. The most dramatic comparison, of course, is when you compare the two great superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. And in that same field, American researchers did a study recently. They took the food prices in their stores and ours, and they translated them into minutes and hours of work at the average income in their country and ours. And they found that with only one exception, the Russian has to work from 2 to 10 times as long to buy the various food items as does the American worker. The one exception was potatoes. There, their price worked out to less work for them than it does here. There was one hitch. They didn't have any potatoes. Some time ago, they turned to a measure of capitalism. They had a problem of morale, low morale among the workers on the Russian collective farms. And so many years ago, they gave each one of those workers a little plot of ground and told him that on his own spare time, he could raise what he wanted to raise on that ground and sell it in the marketplace if he chose. Today, less than 4% of Russia's farmland is privately farmed by those workers. And on that 4% is raised 40% of all of Russia's vegetables and 60% of the meat. And yet, we all seem, in spite of the evidence that proves that the market system is the most efficient system, to continue down that road, bearing out a prophecy that was made about 130 years ago. A French philosopher came to our country. Think of it, we were only 70 years old, and already the United States had become such a miracle of productivity and prosperity that men like himself were enticed here to find out the secret of our greatness. He went back and wrote a book. But even then, 130 years ago, in spite of his admiration, he uttered a warning. He said that if we weren't constantly on guard, we would find ourselves covered by a network of regulations controlling every activity. And he said if that came to pass, we would one day find ourselves a nation of timid animals with government the shepherd. Well, we are covered by tens and tens of thousands of regulations, to which the federal government adds about 25,000 new ones each year. One of the newer agencies, you've probably never had any contact with it, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. I usually hear a murmur when I say that. OSHA. There's a little shop in Indiana, a fellow's got 7 employees. Tiny shop, there's a 12-foot door at front and 12-foot door at the back. OSHA just came in and told him he has to put up exit signs in case a new employee should become confused if there was a fire and not be able to find his way out. He asked a pretty logical question. He said, if he can't see a 12-foot door, how can he see an exit sign? I'm sure everyone in this room at some time or others had an opportunity to crawl up a ladder, a common, ordinary wooden ladder. How we ever did it without the 144 rules and regulations that OSHA has set forth for doing that, I'll never know. The first of those rules is that in order to climb a ladder, you begin by facing it. Then, of course, they didn't forget the farmers either. They discovered that farming is very hazardous, and they put out a manual pointing out all the dangers of farm life, among which was one, they said, when walking about the farm, you should keep your eyes on the ground because here and there might be a slippery substance which, if you step in it, could cause a nasty fall. Now, you know no farmer would have thought of that by himself. But now they've discovered deep-sea divers. There are only about 600 of them in the whole United States, and they get about $50,000 to $100,000 a year because of the hazards of their profession. But OSHA's going to do something about that. They have worked out a whole set of rules, regulations, and special equipment to make diving safe. They haven't implemented the program as yet because the United States Navy also has divers. And they have informed OSHA that if they adopt this program, henceforth every diver will go beneath the waves weighing 1,000 pounds. We laugh, but it's an expensive laugh. A study of 700 of the largest corporations in America has found that if you could eliminate unnecessary regulation, you would reduce the inflation rate in our country instantly by half. Other economists have said that the overregulation of business and industry is a hidden 5-cent sales tax paid by the consumer. The misdirection of capital investment has cost us 250,000 jobs. That's half as many as the president wants to create by spending $32 billion over a 2-year period. And with all of this comes a burden of government-required paperwork. The president of the Eli Lilly Drug Company has said his company spends more man-hours on this paperwork than they do on cancer and heart research combined. He told of submitting a ton of paperwork, 120,000 pages of scientific data in triplicate to the FDA, seeking a license to market an arthritis medicine. This paperwork and the delays have added 50 cents to the cost of every prescription written in the United States. We're no longer first in the development of new medicines as we once were. As a matter of fact, we're way behind a number of other nations. We're producing 60% fewer than we did a few years ago, and the small independent drug companies can no longer afford to experiment and try to find new medicines. It's all in the hands of the giant industries. It all started as late as 1962 with some amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. At that time, developing, testing, and licensing a new medicine cost about $1 million and took from 2 to 4 years. Now it takes as much as $40 million and 7.5 to 20 years. The change could come by simply repealing those amendments. And if you and I would communicate enough with our fellow citizens and not just leave it to the drug industry, if Congress could receive the mail they should receive, there's a young rancher, now a congressman, named Steve Sims from Idaho, who has 113 co-signers on a bill in Washington to simply repeal those amendments, which have nothing to do with our safety or protection from dangerous drugs or medicines, would not endanger us in any way. If you say, well, the problem isn't ours, then how about the independent businessmen and women who spend $50 billion a year sending 10 billion pieces of paper to Washington, where another 20 billion in tax money is spent shuffling and storing that paper? Or the colleges and universities who now find themselves burdened with costly administrative overhead due to government-required paperwork because of the various federal grants and programs. One head of an independent college told me that his administrative bill had gone from $65,000 to more than $600,000. We're so used to talking billions. Does anyone here know how much a billion, a single billion, is? 1 billion minutes ago, Christ was walking on this earth. 1 billion hours ago, our ancestors lived in caves, and it's questionable as to whether they discovered the use of fire or not. To bring it down to something you can visualize, if you gentlemen would send your wives out on a shopping spree and give each one of them $1 billion, but tell them not to spend more than $1,000 a day, they won't be home for 3,000 years. But in Washington, D.C., $1 billion was 19 hours ago. And it's 1 billion in the next 19 and the next 19 on until the new budget is passed, at which time it'll be almost 1.5 billion. If you lose your economic freedom, we all lose our political freedom. Freedom cannot be passed on genetically or in the bloodstream. It's never more than 1 generation away from extinction. And already, many of us, particularly in business and industry, have switched rather than fight. I sometimes am concerned that perhaps the great corporations, too many of them have abdicated their responsibility to preserve the free marketplace out of a fear of retaliation, perhaps, and that's justified. The Commerce Department, a spokesman recently said, business has good reason to fear us, or perhaps a reluctance to rock the boat. But we'd all better learn, when you get in bed with government, you're going to get more than a good night's sleep. Why don't we take inventory and see how many things we can do for ourselves that we believe only government can do? Let's take one that I'm sure everyone accepts is a deserved monopoly of government. And yet, out in Scottsdale, Arizona, there is no city fire department. Their fire damage loss per capita is 1/3 that of comparable cities their size. Their fire protection cost is 1/3 that of comparable cities their size. Scottsdale, Arizona contracts out with a private, profit-making firefighting company that already has about 12 customers now in cities in the western states. Out in Benton, Arkansas, the school board's been having a problem with the hot lunch program. The kids don't want to eat there, and they go someplace else, and the school board's losing $1,000 a month. And the other day in disgust, they went out and had a talk with McDonald's. McDonald's came in and set up shop in the school cafeteria. 10 times as many kids are eating there. McDonald's is making a profit, and the school board's saving the taxpayers $1,000 a month. 2/3 of the cities and towns in America contract out to private collectors of garbage. Their garbage collection cost is 68% lower than the 1/3 of the cities and towns that have their own municipal departments. Have we realized enough that we can fight City Hall? And Mayor, this is just an expression. I don't want anyone fighting your City Hall. Take a look, for example, a little company out in New Mexico, husband and wife owned, 5 employees. She's the president of the company. And the other day, the OSHA inspectors came to her door, knocked on the door, and said they wanted to go through. As you know, that's a hunting expedition to see if they're violating regulations. And if you're violating any of the regulations, you're fined automatically. There is no redress. You're fined for each one. She said, "Where's your warrant?" They said, "We don't need one." She said, "You do to come in here," and close the door. Well, they came back with a warrant. She had her lawyer with her, and he read the warrant. And he says, "This does not show probable cause." The case went to a federal district court, which upheld her right to keep them out. Up in Pocatello, Idaho, there was a man, an elderly man with grown sons. They owned a subcontracting plumbing and electrical firm, 35 employees. He'd often wondered what he would do when his turn came. He'd heard about the woman in New Mexico. They came to his door, and he said, "Not without a warrant," and they read him paragraph 8A of the OSHA Act. And he pointed to a framed copy of the Constitution on the wall and said, "I think there's a higher law." Well, when they came back, they had a court order. And the old boy disregarded the court order. He was cited for contempt of court. His case went to federal court. And his friends tried to persuade him not to, said, "You can't take on the government, a little fellow like you." And I love the line that he gave to his friends. He said, "You know, we send our young sons out to fight and die. Maybe it's time us old duffers did something." And so he went to federal court, and they ruled that paragraph 8A of the OSHA Act violates the 4th Amendment to the Constitution, our protection against illegal search and seizure, and the case is now on appeal by OSHA before the United States Supreme Court. But why don't more of us challenge the arrogance of officialdom? Why don't we set up communications between organizations, trade associations, and so forth, so that we're prepared to rally, to come to the aid of an individual or an industry or a profession when they are threatened by the barons of bureaucracy who have forgotten that we, the people, are their employers. Government by the people will work if the people work at it. We could begin by turning the spotlight of truth on some of that political and economic mythology I spoke about. A recent poll of college and university students found the overwhelming majority estimated business profits in America averaged 45%. Now, that's just 9 times what the profits average. But it was easy to figure why the kids made the mistake. In the same poll, their professors estimated the profits were even higher. There's the fairy tale born of tax demagoguery, that the tax structure is unfair, imposes on the person of lower earnings, and provides loopholes for the more affluent. Well, at $23,000 of earnings today, you are in the top 10% of moneymakers in this country. And that 10% pays 50% of the total income tax, but only takes 5% of the deductions that are allowed under the income tax laws, the so-called loopholes. The other 95% are taken by those who earn from $23,000 down, the 90% who pay the other 50% of the tax. The most dangerous myth is the demagoguery that business can be made to pay a larger share, thus relieving the individual of his burden. Politicians preaching this are either deliberately dishonest or economically illiterate, and I don't know which should puzzle us the most or frighten us the most. Who better than you in business to tell the people of this country once and for all that you don't pay taxes? Business doesn't pay taxes. Business is forced by government to collect taxes. And every tax that business collects must be passed on to the customer in the price of the product as a part of the cost of production. And so therefore, once again, taxes are paid by people. I've tried this on students on a campus, and they look disbelieving, and I use a very simple example. A loaf of bread. If the farmer who raises the wheat can't get enough for his wheat to pay the property tax on his farm, he can't continue to raise wheat. And the same goes for the trucker that hauls it to the mill, and so on up. And so when you ladies buy a loaf of bread tomorrow, take a close look at it, because in that loaf of bread are 131 accumulated taxes which amount to more than half the price of the loaf of bread. Politicians love these hidden taxes because they hide from the people the true cost of government. I said it was the fastest increasing cost item. 25 years ago, government cost prorated out to $1,600 per family. Today, they prorate out to $9,600 per family. And government uses the taxing system not just to raise revenue, but to achieve a great many social reforms. It's unconstitutional to manipulate the economy in this way, but if you'll remember, during the New Deal days, an Undersecretary of the Treasury told the Congress and even wrote a book in which he said that taxes must be viewed as having a higher purpose than just raising revenue. He said they could be used as an instrument of social and economic control to distribute the wealth and the income and to penalize particular industries and economic groups. We need to put an end to that. We need a simplification of the tax structure. We need an indexing of the surtax brackets to halt government's profiteering on inflation. Every time the cost of living index goes up 1 percentage point, government's revenues increase 1.5%. Above all, we need an overall cut in the cost of government. Government spending is not an economic stimulant. It is a drag on the economy. Only a decade ago, about 15% of corporate gross income was required to pay the interest on corporate debt. Now it's 40%. Individuals and families once spent about 8% on interest on their consumer buying, their installment buying, and on their home mortgages. Now it's almost a fourth of their disposable income. 15 years, state and local debt has gone from $70 billion to $220 billion, and the private and public debt in America today is growing 4 times as fast as the output of goods and services. Again, there's something we can do. A fellow who used to quarterback the Buffalo Bills, Jack Kemp, is a congressman. He has introduced a bill in Congress in this session alone 5 times. The majority has voted against it. It calls for a 3-year annual installment cut across the board in the income tax that in 3 years would amount to a full reduction of 1/3. The corporate tax would be reduced from 48 to 45%. That private income tax would wind up, the 14% base would be 8%, and the ceiling of 70 would be 50%. The exemption for smaller business from the surtax would be double what it is now. It would restore incentives to work, to produce, and it would provide the investment capital that industry needs in this country today. It would create jobs. We can say this with assurance because this was done exactly back in the early 20s, and it was done again in the 60s, and both times the broadening of the economic base was so immediate that even government got more money at the lower tax rates. But too many in Congress are concerned with further restrictions on our freedom, land planning that threatens the concept of private ownership, the Humphrey Hawkins bill, which I think would regulate economy in this country to an extent we've never seen except in socialist or totalitarian countries. In California, my own state, the legislature talks of setting up a state-owned bank with tax money to compete with the privately owned banks. The last time Jack Kemp's bill appeared in Congress, he got 195 votes. It'll be coming up again. We can have that tax cut once again if we, the people, will make our wishes known. And so it is with all the other problems confronting us. If we remain voiceless, the doctor will continue his lonely fight against socialized medicine. The oil industry alone will fight divestiture and crippling controls and repressive taxes. The farmer, who is hurt by the cost-price squeeze perhaps more than anyone and changes of rules in the middle of the game, will be alone. But each one of those issues concerns all of us, regardless of our trade or profession. Corporate America must realize its allies are the independent businessmen and women, the shopkeepers, the craftsmen, and the farmers and the professionals. We're all organized in a great many ways: chambers of commerce, trade associations, the Farm Bureau, professional associations. For too long, we've talked among ourselves in each group. It's time we started talking as groups to each other. I mentioned the oil companies. Is any one of us that doesn't have a stake in the energy industry? The government caused the problem while we stood by, unaware that we were involved. Unnecessary regulations and fixed prices imposed back in the 50s are the direct cause of today's crisis. Our problem isn't a shortage of fuel, it's a surplus of government. Now we have a new agency, 20,000 employees and a $10.5 billion budget to begin with. That budget will amount to 10 cents on the price of gasoline for every gallon that will be sold next year. It is nothing more than the first step in nationalizing the energy industry. They panic us, invoke panic to tell us that we've found all the oil and gas there is, we're going to run out. 57 years ago, our government told us in 1920 we only had enough oil left for 15 years. 19 years went by and they told us we only had enough left for 13 years. We've done a lot of driving since then, and we'll do a lot more if government will get out of the way and turn the energy industry loose to find, with the market incentives available to it, the sources of energy and fuel that we need. You know, they've said that politics is the second oldest profession. I have come to realize it bears a great similarity to the first. Why can't we look at other nations that have chosen this course of government intervention before us? Our British cousins. Until recently, I was saying in 15 years at the present rate, we'll soon be where they are now. We don't have 15 years anymore. 40 years, Sweden held up to view as a great example that socialism will work in an enlightened society. They've had it for 40 years, and then last year the Swedes went to the polls and voted against Karl Marx. I think the straw that broke the camel's back was a change in the income tax rates. In Sweden now, the income tax rate on $33,000 of earnings is 102%. We've had enough of sideline kibitzers telling us the system which they themselves have thrown out of sync by their social tinkering can be improved by more social tinkering or even management and control by government itself. They play fast and loose with a system that for 200 years has made us the light of the world, the refuge for people all over the world who yearn to breathe free. That system has never failed us once. We have failed it a number of times, every time we lose faith in the magic of the marketplace. The poverty level, we were recently told by our government in America, is $5,500 of earnings. At that level of earnings, you are poor. Well, the example of the greatness of our system is $5,500 is 8 times as high as the average standard of living in the rest of the world. A Supreme Court justice said, "It is time, the time has come indeed, is long overdue, for the wisdom, the ingenuity, and the resources of American business to be marshaled against those who would destroy it." What specifically should be done? Well, the first essential is for businessmen to confront the problem as a primary responsibility of corporate management. It's been said that history is the patter of silken slippers descending the stairs and the thunder of hobnail boots coming up. We've all heard the thunder of those hobnail boots many times in our life. And now some of the people who've heard them in their own land and sought this land as a refuge are seeing signs here that they ignored earlier in their own homeland. And they wonder if they'll have to flee again. Except today, there's no place to escape to. Freedom is saved here, or it is gone in the world forever. Will we, before it is too late, use the vitality of the marketplace to save this way of life? Or will we face our children and our children's children one day when they ask us where we were and what we were doing on the day that freedom was lost. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Governor Reagan. The meeting is adjourned.
Don't trip on that wire there.
The preceding program was a WQLN Public Affairs presentation, made possible in part by Security Bank.